Show don't tell is overrated. Yes, it has its place, but many times it feels out of place. And many times it can bog down a story that could be told in a much better way. One of the best examples of this is a scene from Mortal Engines. Near the end of the film, Hester learns that the main villain is her dad. It comes entirely out of left field, doesn't affect the story in any way, and is done in the most cringeworthy way possible. All the main villain says is that you know. Then they cut away to a flashback explaining what he means. Compare this to the best twist in cinema history. Luke learns that Darth Vader is his dad. Darth Vader flat out says, "I am your father." There's no cringy cutaways, and we learn Darth Vader is Luke's dad. Darth Vader told him, and it affects the story in a meaningful way. But this video is not all about plot twist or all about show don't tell. We're going to talk about exposition. Exposition is one of the most hated parts of the screenwriting or movie making process. Writers struggle to know where to put it in, and directors struggle to direct it. Any Google search of how to do exposition will bring up quite a few, but what's never mentioned is that these tools, while they can be helpful, they do have their downsides. There's a time and place for exposition, and there's a time and place for the tips and tools on how to use it. So today we're going to take a look at how to craft exposition in a story. In his book Screenplay, Sid Field writes, "Dialogue in general is hard to write. The more you do it, the better you get." I think this applies to exposition as well as dialogue. In his book Story, Robert McKee writes, "Exposition means facts, the information about setting, biography, and characterization that the audience needs to know to follow and comprehend the events of the story. Exposition displays the skill of a writer. Skill in exposition means making it invisible." In his book Save the Cat, Blake Snyder gives a way to bury exposition. In the chapter The Immutable Laws of Screenplay Physics, he outlines a little trick he calls the pope and the pull. The essence of this trick is that when you have boring exposition, you give something so shocking to the audience that they don't listen to the exposition. His example is from a friend's screenplay where some exposition had to be said. As they outline the plan, the pope is swimming laps in the pool, and at the end of the scene we haven't heard a word that they've said because we're so shocked. The Vatican has a pool? The pope doesn't wear his hat all the time? Blake Snyder goes on to explain, "We the audience aren't even listening." I think that could be a problem. If the audience isn't listening to your exposition, then why are you even giving it to them? In another sentence, he calls it potentially joy-killing exposition. The audience doesn't hate exposition. Sometimes it can get annoying, and sometimes it can get long-winded, but a lot of times the audience actually enjoys exposition. But I think the essence of his trick is that he wants you to be creative with your exposition. A good example would be the scene in Guardians of the Galaxy where Rocket explains the plan on how they're going to escape from this prison. As he outlines the step-by-step process, Groot's in the background just doing it. The only part the audience actually hears and understands is at the very end, when Rocket explains, "Well, I guess we'll have to do that one first." This is a clever way to hide the exposition, because while Rocket's explaining it, we aren't even listening. If it's important exposition, you probably shouldn't try and bury it, but the essence of his rule is to be creative. Like the Austin Powers films, there's a character literally named Basil Exposition. Every time he appears on screen, he's played for laughs, but he does get the exposition across. A better example would probably be the funny guards from Pirates of the Caribbean. While Jack Sparrow is trying to steal a ship, he distracts them by having them argue over the Black Pearl. The writers, Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, get the information about the Black Pearl across while having the audience entertained. By being creative with your exposition, you're technically burying it. The audience will catch it subconsciously. This is an effective way to bury your exposition. Be creative with it. Come up with different ways to get the exposition across. But a lot of times the audience may not hear it in this manner. And while you technically got it in there, you may just be wasting screen time. And while it is a funny way to craft seemingly unimportant information, it probably shouldn't be used for more important exposition. This brings us to our next point, which is from Robert McKee. In his book Story, he outlines ways to withhold exposition and use it for powerful turning points. One of the best examples is the scene in Star Wars. We could have had this spoiled in the first movie, or we could have had it spoiled by some minor character halfway through, but instead, they hide this information from the characters and from the audience until it's time for an explosive turning point. Unlike the scene in Mortal Engines, it affects the story, and drives it even until the next film. By withholding information, we add a mystery to it and can create powerful turning points, surprises. Another example would be the scene in Jurassic World. We have a basic understanding of what the Indominus Rex is made of, its genes and DNA, but they do mention there's some other stuff in there. They either don't know or they aren't allowed to tell. And then in an explosive turning point, in the middle of a big action scene, we learn it was mixed with raptor. and the Indominus Rex is the new Alpha Raptor. The premise of Robert McKee's argument is that you dramatize the exposition. It can be done in many different ways, and withholding it is only one. But when you dramatize exposition, the primary purpose of a scene is to further the immediate conflict. Its secondary purpose is to convey information. If we go back to the Pirates of the Caribbean scene, we understand the primary purpose is for Jack Sparrow to get a ship. The secondary purpose is to convey information about the Black Pearl. If this information is needed, the writer must create a motivation for the dialogue that's greater than the facts. Another way to dramatize exposition is to convert it into ammunition. This would go back to the Star Wars example, or any other great scene where characters have to argue a point, and by arguing and taking a stand on a point, they effectively convey the exposition. If you challenge a character in the exposition like the opening scene in Aliens, you give a reason for the exposition to be shown. As the characters argue their position, the audience begins to understand what happened. Dramatizing exposition is the basic point of show don't tell. By showing the audience a scene of conflict, we may understand something we would have just been told otherwise. In this way, show don't tell makes sense. Show don't tell has its place in dramatizing exposition, but many times show don't tell means prolonging a scene's runtime. By using a scene as conflict and showing the audience a natural situation instead of just having a character tell something, the scene becomes longer. In one of the films I wrote, the first 20 minutes was incredibly boring. I was going through exposition as quick as possible, but when I dramatized every scene, it would make each scene a lot longer. A 1-minute scene that got the facts across became a 6-minute scene that showed the facts. And when your whole story becomes about setting up exposition, you sometimes forget to tell the story you're trying to tell. Dramatizing exposition has a place. Show don't tell has a place, but sometimes when you dramatize exposition, you can end up showing the audience something they already knew. You should never include anything the audience can reasonably and easily assume has happened. So if you do want to dramatize your exposition, here are some of the best ways to turn it into conflict. Naturally, a character has a backstory. It can be tragic, but the characters just never come out and say it. They hold something back. By dramatizing a scene, you can have a character not want to say something. They don't want to tell something important. The audience begins to wonder why, and then when they give the answer, flat-out exposition, we understand it. Other ways of dramatizing a scene is by introducing a new character that gets told the information. Robert McKee calls this table dusting. It comes from stage plays where a new maid would be introduced and work with the older maid, and while they dusted the furniture, the more established maid would tell the very tragic backstory of this ancient house. Table dusting has a place, but the new character that gets told this has to be a critical part of the story. You don't introduce just some random side character that doesn't know anything just for that one scene and then get rid of them. If you want to use table dusting effectively, your new character should probably be the protagonist. Another way of dramatizing exposition is by focusing on one trait that leads to others. Like the opening scene from The Social Network. The one trait we focus on is that Mark is all about himself. He cares only about himself, and he's socially awkward. As Aaron Sorkin develops this one trait, he also throws in other things, about other characters, about the backstory, and about events in the past or events that are going to be set up quickly in the future. Dramatizing exposition sometimes doesn't have to be hard. It can sometimes be as easy as making it interesting. When a character has to learn about something, you can introduce comedy or add a sense of danger, like the scenes in the Dark Knight trilogy where Fox has to introduce something to Batman. By adding a sense of danger or comedy to an object being introduced, we the audience are engaged with this exposition. Or like in a James Bond movie when Q introduces the new stuff. Adding a sense of danger or mystery makes it fun. A good example of this is the scene in Black Panther where they explain the new suit. Explaining how it stores energy is interesting, but it might get a bit long-winded if it wasn't for the comedy. If this scene was written without Shuri's motivation, it would have become boring, but knowing that there may be a hidden motivation throughout this scene makes it that much better. Dramatizing your exposition can be great, but sometimes it leads to long runtime. Sometimes adding cinema to it or making it more visual only prolongs the story. You can get bogged down in the exposition instead of the story you're trying to tell. Exposition is supposed to be facts, the information about the setting, the biography, and characterization that the audience needs to know to follow and comprehend the events of the story. When you focus so much on the exposition instead of the story, the audience won't be engaged. So if dramatizing exposition doesn't work for your story, sometimes the best way to go about it is to just do it. There's countless exposition scenes that work, and all they are is a character telling another character about something important. The scene where they introduce stuff in Men in Black has some comedy in it, but it's also pretty interesting, just by itself. It's just exposition being told. And like in Pirates of the Caribbean, there's some incredible scenes where it's just one character explaining something to someone else. And in The Lord of the Rings, explaining history and backstory can sometimes be interesting. But the best way to go about just telling exposition is to make the audience crave it. In his book, The Anatomy of Story, John Truby outlines exactly how to do this. A movie like The Matrix introduces something insanely complicated or crazy. It hooks the audience's attention. and then when we decide to explain it, the audience is hanging on your every word. In Jurassic Park, there's dinosaurs. How in the world? Now we're excited to hear about this exposition of how they got the dinosaurs. In Men in Black, there's some insane alien stuff going on. How do they keep them under control? Now they give the exposition. In Pirates of the Caribbean, we wonder what's after Jack Sparrow. Now it's time for the exposition, and we hang on its every word. So maybe you want to bury your exposition, make it creative, or maybe you want to withhold it and use it for a powerful turning point. You want to dramatize your exposition and make each scene a bit longer. Or maybe you just want to do it. You want to make the audience crave the exposition and enjoy it when it happens. Each of these points are valid for crafting exposition, but the thing is, you should use multiple tricks. Sometimes you should show the audience. You should dramatize the scene. Sometimes you should just bury it, and sometimes you should just do it. If you use one trick too much, the pitfalls will start setting in. Using multiple tricks diversifies the exposition, especially if there's a lot of it, but none of them are foolproof to a sufficiently talented fool. If you want to write boring exposition, you can do it. It's up to you to make it creative, to make it interesting, to use multiple tricks and pull out every trick in the bag to turn it into something interesting. But if you're just going to write straight up exposition, you need to know how. You need to know the rules of how to write exposition before you can break them and just write boring exposition. Exposition doesn't make or break a movie, but sometimes it can bog it down, and sometimes it can elevate it. But your goal should be to make the exposition invisible. You won't get it right the first time, but the more you do it, the better it gets. And like Sid Field's quote, dialogue in general is hard to write. The more you do it, the better you